Now, iRacing has an auto tuning function built in, which is the best way, I think, to avoid clipping and get the maximum amount of dynamic range out of the game settings. So what I like to do is set my wheel force to the maximum amount of force that I have set at. So remember, we set it to 70% before, which is about 10 Newton meters. And then we're gonna use the auto tune feature for our strength. So you can see at the moment it's set to 12, and we can see the little auto button is disabled. So if we now close this off, we'll click done. You can see now we've got our little force feedback gauge here. So you can see that bar moves around as we move the steering. And you can see we've got our graphics adjustments here as well. Now, when the auto calibration is complete, we'll see a little auto button pop up here, and that will allow us to adjust our force feedback strength to allow for the maximum amount of dynamic range with minimal amount of clipping. Now, we may still see a little bit of clipping, which will be indicated by this gauge turning red and maxing out when we're doing things like hitting walls or bumping into other cars. But the aim here is to make use of the maximum amount of dynamic range under normal driving conditions. So bumping over ripple strips, you know, running over grass, little bits and pieces like that. We want to get as much dynamic range there as possible. We don't really care if it starts to clip a little bit when we're bumping into walls, because, you know, it doesn't really, the detail doesn't really matter in those kinds of scenarios. So what we should see here is a force feedback gauge kind of, you know, bouncing around a little bit like that as we run over road textures, grass textures, ripple strips, and then we should see it bumping up as we go through corners when the cornering force is enabled. And then if we really bump over ripple strips, we'll see it bump up. And if we hit walls, we should see it going up into the red zone. So we're gonna head out on track now. We're in the Cayman GT4 today around Montreal, which is a good track to test with because it's got some really aggressive curves that you do need to bump over to go nice and fast. And you kind of run right out up against the grass for a couple of corners as well without ripple strips. So it's really important to be able to feel when you're dipping a wheel onto the grass. Now, admittedly, this isn't the most lively car in the world, but you do get a good sense of traction control kicking, and you kind of have to balance the back end. You can kind of feel the back end breaking away a little bit, even under ABS, as you turn into turn 1 in particular as well. So it's a good track to test with. We will test out a couple of other cars, and of course we will test out some other sims a little bit later on as well for you to give you the full picture. But let's head out now. I'll get my headphones on. We'll run through this auto calibration. It should take about half a lap, I would imagine, before we see auto pop up on the screen. And then once that happens, we should be good to set our maximum strength automatically. So what we're going to feel here initially is the force feedback is going to be super strong. Or at least it might not be that strong because force feedback is only set to 12. But then once the auto cal's finished, we'll be able to adjust that down. So let's head out here now. We're going to keep an eye on that force feedback gauge. We will see that it will max out a few times probably, and it does feel very stiff to me. One thing I will comment on though is that the overall feeling of the force feedback is very, very, very smooth, and that was something that did impress me immediately with this wheelbase, even before we got in a car and drive. And even though I said before that the first impression wasn't fantastic, one thing I will say, and I always comment on this whenever I jump in a car, does it feel notchy? Does it feel grainy? Is there any cogging effect present, just sort of sitting stationary? And you can see there on the screen, as I turn the wheels, the car is kind of lifting up on one side or the other as the wheels turn, the contact patch changes. And that is represented really well with this wheel. I can feel the wheel kind of raising up on its sides. But yeah, this wheelbase does feel every bit as smooth, I'm very happy to say, as the SimiCube 2s do, just through turning in rotation here. There's no cogging effect present at all. So let's get driving again. Just wanted to make sure that was clear for you guys. So we are going to be on cold tires initially as well, but we'll bump over a couple of ripple strips here. And that is a little bit too stiff for me at the moment. You can see it was just about maxing out. It feels like force feedback strength of 12 is actually not too bad, but I'm not seeing any clipping just yet. And what's important here is you can see the road texture is represented by those little tiny bounces in the force feedback. So even when I'm driving straight, I'm not putting any turning force on the wheel. You can see those little ripples, and that's the road texture that should be being communicated through the wheel. Now, okay, there you go. Now you can see the auto buttons popped up. So let's just quickly come to a stop again. And if we hit that auto button, 16.2, so it actually ended up putting it up a little bit. So let's just go for a little bit more of a drive again. Okay, turn. So we can see we were starting to get up into the yellow zone there. But we'll see how it goes when we bump over the curves in the final turn here past the Wall of Champions. Brake a little early because we are still on cold tyres. Get up over the ripple. Okay, yeah, you could see it was clipping there. So I'm not super happy with that auto calibration. I might actually wind that back down to about 10, I think. I think it probably just didn't have quite enough time to adjust itself fully because we weren't really driving at full speed. I think if we'd been more aggressive, it would have probably calibrated a little bit lower. But you get the idea of how that's meant to work. We'll get turned in again here. Okay, now you can see as we go over those ripple strips, we're making full use of the force feedback. So we're getting all of that fidelity, but we're not getting any clipping. We'll just test it again through here quickly as well. Bump up over the ripple, and yeah, that's fine. No clipping there going on at all. But if we do put it into a wall, you should see it will go red. There you go. So yeah, as we hit the wall, it did clip. But again, that's not important because we don't really need to feel the detail in a crash. It's more important that we're making full use of the dynamic range for normal driving.